Welcome to your daily news deep dive. We're going to sort through today's headlines on climate change, government actions, and environmental concerns.
Lots to unpack today, from the New York Times and the LA Times to The Guardian, even some scientific journals.
Let's jump right in. The Trump administration is under fire for their latest moves. They've unfrozen funding for some EPA programs.
Which sounds great, but at the same time, they're being criticized for cuts at the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
So kind of a mixed bag?
Right. Definitely, releasing EPA funds seems like it could be good for the environment, but then slashing disaster recovery funding.
Especially with all the crazy weather we've been having.
Exactly. Climate change is making those events more intense and frequent, so cutting disaster recovery funding just doesn't make sense.
It's like they're giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And it doesn't stop there. The administration is also dropping work on stronger building codes for disasters.
So again, good news for the EPA, but then they weaken protections elsewhere. Makes you wonder what's really going on.
What's the motivation behind these decisions?
Well, a top Trump aide hinted at tying federal aid to Los Angeles with actions targeting the California Coastal Commission.
So maybe it's not just about the budget.
Could be a deeper political agenda at play.
We'll have to see how that unfolds. But before we move on, let's zoom out to the international stage. The Trump administration has also decided to halt U.S. participation in a key IPCC climate meeting.
Not a huge surprise, given their stance on climate change.
True, but it does leave a bit of a void in global leadership on this issue.
Definitely, other nations might have to step up now that the U.S. is taking a step back.
Like China and the EU?
Potentially. Speaking of the EU, they just announced a major initiative called the Clean Industrial Deal.
Aiming to be a global leader in the circular economy by 2030, pretty ambitious?
Definitely. Not just about reducing emissions, but also changing how we produce and consume things.
A total overhaul of industrial practices. Will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Lots of skepticism. Of course, critics are wondering who's going to pay for it all.
Yeah, these large-scale green initiatives aren't cheap.
True, but they're overlooking the potential benefits of a circular economy.
Like what?
Think job creation, resource efficiency. It could be a win-win if they can pull it off.
We'll keep an eye on that. Now let's shift back to the U.S. and a story that's causing some concern on the West Coast. Scientists have found H5N1 bird flu in rats in Southern California.
That's a new development and a little unsettling.
Right, this virus keeps spreading and adapting.
Now it's in rats, which means it's jumped to another species.
And that raises the risk of it spreading to humans.
Exactly, which would be a major public health threat.
And adding to those worries, the CDC has a new report out suggesting possible transmission of bird flu from exposed dairy workers to their pet cats.
It's all connected: human health, animal health, environmental health.
It's a complex web, and as if that wasn't enough, there's also a potential carcinogen that's been found in the water supply.
In areas affected by the California wildfires.
Another layer of concern on top of everything else.
It's a stark reminder that the impacts of disasters go way beyond the immediate damage.
It's a long road to recovery. And on the topic of resources, a new report has found that large corporations, especially those in high-carbon industries, are funneling most of their profits to shareholders.
Instead of investing in clean energy initiatives.
So basically choosing profits over the planet.
Seems that way, even though many of these companies talk a big game about sustainability.
Actions speak louder than words, right?
Exactly. And speaking of corporate actions, a new research center at the University of California, San Francisco, is launching an investigation into how corporations might be influencing public health.
That's interesting. What are they focusing on?
They're looking at how industries manipulate science and regulations to downplay health risks.
From things like chemicals, fossil fuels, and ultra-processed foods.
Right. They want to understand how corporate influence is shaping public health policy and outcomes.
Transparency and accountability are so important.
Definitely. And speaking of misleading information, remember the energy emergency the Trump administration declared?
To fast-track fossil fuel projects.
Right. Well, it turns out some of the projects benefiting from this have nothing to do with energy production.
Like a housing development and a gold mine.
Exactly. So it seems the energy emergency might be more about pushing through projects that benefit certain industries.
Regardless of the actual need for energy or the environmental impact.
Seems like it.
It's concerning. And on that note, the Trump administration has just approved a license for a massive deepwater oil export terminal off the coast of Texas.
While proponents are touting the economic benefits, environmental groups are worried about the risks.
Like oil spills.
Exactly, and the impact on marine ecosystems.
It's a tough call, economic development versus environmental protection.
A debate that's happening everywhere. And speaking of difficult choices, there's growing concern about the long-term impact of mass firings at various government agencies.
Including the Interior Department, FEMA, and the FDA.
These cuts are affecting scientists, researchers, disaster relief workers, and food safety inspectors, to name a few.
Seems like a recipe for disaster, no pun intended.
Critics argue that these reductions could weaken federal oversight of public lands, environmental protections, and scientific research.
All things that are crucial for public safety and our future.
Exactly.
Now let's turn our attention back to climate change. A new analysis has revealed that glaciers worldwide are melting at an alarming rate.
Losing about 270 billion tons of ice per year since 2000.
That's a staggering number.
It really highlights the urgency of addressing climate change. Melting glaciers contribute to rising sea levels, threaten freshwater supplies, and disrupt ecosystems.
The choices we make today will have a ripple effect on the planet for generations to come. And while the world grapples with this massive issue, there's another challenge facing us: the adoption of electric vehicles.
There's definitely growing interest, but there are also some hurdles to overcome.
Like what?
Concerns about battery safety, driving range, and, of course, the cost of EVs.
Valid concerns.
But there's a potential game changer on the horizon. Lithium iron phosphate batteries.
LFP batteries.
Yes, they're cheaper, safer, and have a longer lifespan than the current standard.
That sounds promising, but is there a catch?
There's always a catch, right? Geopolitical issues are complicating things, which just shows how interconnected all these problems are.
Climate change, technology, economics, international relations. It's all intertwined.
It is. And amidst all these global trends and tech advancements, it's important to remember the human impact.
For instance, months after Hurricane Helene devastated North Carolina, farmers are still struggling to rebuild.
State and federal aid has been slow to arrive,
Leaving many in a difficult situation.
It's a reminder that behind the statistics and policy debates, there are real people whose lives are being deeply affected by these events.
And on a slightly more positive note, a new study shows that urban microforests are gaining popularity as a way to combat pollution and restore biodiversity in cities.
These mini-forests are densely packed with native trees and can grow up to 10 times faster than conventional forests,
They're not just pretty, they offer a host of environmental benefits.
like improved air and water quality, reduced urban heat, and enhanced wildlife habitat.
Small actions can make a big difference. It's all about empowering people to take action.
Absolutely. Even small steps can contribute to a more sustainable future.
Now let's circle back to the U.S. and the EPA's Climate Fund. They've announced a $20 billion fund for climate projects, but there's a twist.
They're trying to claw back billions of dollars already allocated to green banks,
That's created a lot of confusion and even led to the resignation of a top prosecutor.
raising questions about transparency and accountability.
What's the real motive here?
It's a situation that needs close scrutiny,
And while that drama unfolds, the Trump administration is facing another legal challenge.
this time over their decision to expand offshore drilling,
Another example of the tension between economic interests and environmental concerns.
a debate that will only intensify as we move forward.
It's a reminder that the transition to a cleaner energy future won't be easy. There will be tough choices and trade-offs along the way.
And the voices of those who prioritize environmental protection must be heard.
Absolutely. Now let's hop across the pond to the UK. They're set to end their tax exemption for electric car drivers in April.
Meaning they'll face a 195 road tax charge.
Interesting. This decision has sparked debate about the best way to encourage EV adoption.
Some argue that removing incentives will slow down progress, while others believe it's necessary for a level playing field.
A complex issue for sure. And speaking of complex issues, new research has found that warming temperatures could lead to a higher proportion of female sea turtles.
Potentially skewing the sex ratio and impacting population viability.
Another example of how climate change is impacting the natural world in ways we might not even fully grasp.
It's a reminder that the impacts of climate change are far-reaching and interconnected. We need a holistic approach to address this challenge.
Agreed. So much to think about today.
We only just scratched the surface.
But that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Tune in tomorrow as we continue to explore the latest news and insights on climate change, government actions, and environmental concerns.
And it could stifle innovation and slow the transition to a cleaner economy.
It's a reminder that investing in a sustainable future is not just good for the planet, but also for the economy.
Definitely a win-win. And speaking of a win-win, there's been some positive news about the Ala.
The Allah.
You know, the Hawaiian crew?
Oh, right, the one that was almost extinct.
Exactly, it's making a comeback.
That's amazing. How do they do
A
it?
successful reintroduction program. They've been releasing captive-bred birds back into the wild.
And it's working.
It is. They're actually flying free again in the forests of Maui.
That's fantastic. It gives me hope.
Me too. It shows that conservation efforts can really pay off.
It's a victory for nature. And speaking of nature, a new study suggests that we could turn golf courses into havens for biodiversity.
Rewilding golf courses could create habitats for wildlife, improve water quality, and provide recreational opportunities for communities.
That's an interesting idea.
Right now, golf courses are often resource-intensive and chemically treated.
Not exactly environmentally friendly.
Not really, but by rewilding them, we could create landscapes that are both beautiful and beneficial.
And speaking of beneficial landscapes, there's another study about urban microforests.
These mini forests can grow much faster than conventional forests.
And they can help combat pollution, reduce urban heat, and restore biodiversity in cities.
So it's like bringing a little piece of nature into the concrete jungle.
I love that. And speaking of urban environments, there's been a lot of talk about this shift to electric vehicles.
It's a crucial step towards a cleaner transportation system, but we need to be mindful of the potential downsides as well.
Like what?
Well, mining the materials for EV batteries can have a significant environmental and social impact.
We don't want to solve one problem by creating another.
Exactly. We need to ensure that the transition to electric vehicles is done sustainably and ethically.
So it's not just about switching to EVs, it's about how we produce them as well.
Exactly. The entire supply chain needs to be considered. And speaking of interconnectedness, a new study has found that warming temperatures could lead to more peatland fires in the UK.
Peatland fires.
Yes. Peatlands are these huge areas of partially decayed plant matter.
Oh, right, like bogs and mires.
Exactly. They store massive amounts of carbon.
So when they burned, they release that carbon into the atmosphere.
Exactly. Which contributes to climate change.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And this study found that as temperatures rise, peatlands are becoming drier and more susceptible to fires.
So climate change is making the problem worse.
It is, and that's why protecting and restoring peatlands is crucial for mitigating climate change.
It's another piece of the puzzle. Speaking of puzzles, the Trump administration's plan to clean up the debris from the recent wildfires in Los Angeles in just 1 month is raising eyebrows.
A lot of experts and residents are saying that timeline is unrealistic.
And potentially dangerous.
Exactly. We're talking about hazardous waste here.
Rushing the cleanup could lead to contamination of soil, water, and air.
It's crucial to take the necessary precautions and ensure that the cleanup is done thoroughly and safely.
It's a reminder that quick fixes aren't always the best solutions.
Definitely. Sometimes you need to slow down to ensure things are done right. And speaking of long-term consequences, a new study has found that coastal erosion is threatening the ancient city of Alexandria in Egypt.
That's heartbreaking.
It is rising sea levels and coastal erosion are a threat to historical sites and vulnerable communities all over the world.
Climate change is already having a real impact.
It is, and this study highlights the need for adaptation measures to protect these areas.
We need to act now before it's too late.
Agreed. And speaking of urgent action, there was a bit of a crisis in Alabama recently.
What happened?
Federal funding for low-income utility assistance was temporarily halted.
Because of an executive order from President Trump.
Yes, but the funding has since been restored after a public outcry.
Still, it's concerning that essential social programs can be so easily disrupted.
It highlights the vulnerability of these programs and the need to protect them from political interference.
We need to ensure that everyone has access to essential services regardless of their income or political affiliation.
Absolutely. And speaking of essential services, is growing concern about the impact of staff cuts at the National Park Service and the Forest Service.
These cuts are affecting the management and protection of our public lands.
Exactly. National parks and forests are vital for conservation, recreation, and the economy.
They're national treasures. We need to protect them.
Absolutely. And these cuts are making it harder to do that.
It's a short-sighted decision that could have long-term consequences. And speaking of long-term consequences, a new study has found that warming temperatures could lead to a higher proportion of female sea turtles.
Which could potentially skew the sex ratio and impact population viability.
That's fascinating. How does temperature affect the sex of sea turtles?
It's called temperature-dependent sex determination.
So the temperature of the nest during incubation determines whether the hatchlings will be male or female.
Exactly.
And warmer temperatures are leading to more females.
It seems that way, which could have a significant impact on sea turtle populations in the long run.
Another example of how climate change is impacting the natural world in subtle yet profound ways.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we need to pay attention to these subtle shifts because they can have cascading effects on ecosystems.
It's all connected.
It is. And speaking of connections, the UK has decided to end its tax exemption for electric car drivers.
Starting in April.
Yes, which means they'll have to pay a £195 road tax charge.
That's a significant change.
It is, and it's sparked a debate about the best way to encourage EV adoption,
Some people argue that removing incentives will slow down progress.
while others believe it's necessary to create a level playing field for all vehicles.
It's a tough call.
It is. There are pros and cons to both approaches.
It'll be interesting to see how this decision affects EV adoption rates in the UK. And speaking of impacts, a new report has raised concern about the safety risks associated with the proposed deepwater oil terminal near Texas,
This terminal would handle massive oil tankers.
increasing the risk of spills and accidents.
Exactly, and it would expose coastal communities to those risks.
It's a classic example of the tension between economic development and environmental protection.
And in this case, the potential risks to the environment and public health seem to outweigh the economic benefits.
We need to prioritize safety and sustainability over short-term profits.
Absolutely. And speaking of sustainability, there's growing concern about the Trump administration's cuts to the Department of Housing and Urban Development,
These cuts could slow down the delivery of disaster aid to hard-hit communities.
especially those in rural areas.
So the people who need help the most will be the ones who suffer the most.
It seems that way, and it raises serious questions about the administration's commitment to disaster relief and recovery.
It's a reminder that we need to hold our leaders accountable for their actions and ensure that they prioritize the needs of the people.
Absolutely. And speaking of accountability, a new report suggests that some companies are backing away from their commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and sustainability initiatives.
That's disappointing.
It is. It seems like some companies are feeling pressure to prioritize profits over everything else.
Even their stated values.
Exactly. But consumers and investors have the power to change that.
By supporting companies that align with their values.
Exactly. We need to vote with our wallets and our voices.
Absolutely. And speaking of voting with our wallets, there's a new report highlighting the lack of affordable solar power in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
This is forcing indigenous communities to rely on wood for fuel, which is contributing to deforestation and perpetuating a cycle of poverty.
It's a reminder that the transition to a sustainable future needs to be just and equitable.
Absolutely. We need to ensure that everyone has access to clean and affordable energy.
And that the benefits of clean energy are shared by all communities.
Exactly. And speaking of sharing the benefits, a lawsuit against Greenpeace is raising concerns among environmental groups.
What's the lawsuit about?
It's being seen as an attempt to bankrupt the organization and silence dissent.
That's concerning.
It is environmental activists play a crucial role in holding corporations and governments accountable.
We need to protect their right to protest and speak out against environmental injustice.
Absolutely. And speaking of injustice, scientists are urging caution after detecting a carcinogen in the water supply in areas affected by the recent wildfires in Los Angeles.
Another consequence of the wildfire.
It is. This contamination poses a serious risk to public health.
It highlights the need for thorough and comprehensive recovery efforts.
We need to address both the immediate damage and the potential for long-term harm.
It's a long road to recovery.
It is. And speaking of long roads, protesters and elected officials in Los Angeles are taking action to halt the flow of toxic debris to local landfills.
They're worried about contamination.
Exactly. These landfills aren't equipped to handle hazardous materials.
Sending the debris there could contaminate soil and water.
It's a classic case of NIMBY not in my backyard.
But in this case, their concerns are valid.
Absolutely. We need to ensure that hazardous waste is handled responsibly.
And that communities aren't disproportionately burdened with the risks.
Exactly. And speaking of burdens, the Trump administration's plan to use a popular beach in Los Angeles as a staging site for sorting through debris from the wildfires is facing backlash.
Residents and environmental groups are worried about contamination.
It's a sensitive area.
A beach.
Yes, rushing the process without adequate safeguards could lead to serious environmental damage.
It seems like they're trying to cut corners.
It does seem that way, and it highlights the need for careful planning and transparency in disaster recovery efforts.
We need to ensure that the environment and public health are protected.
Absolutely. And speaking of protection, developing countries are urging wealthier nations to step up their climate action commitment.
Ahead of the climate summit in Brazil.
Yes. They're calling for increased financial support and more ambitious emissions reduction targets.
It's a reminder that climate change is a global issue that requires global cooperation.
Absolutely. and that wealthy nations have a responsibility to help developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change.
And speaking of global cooperation, Sweden's Supreme Court has rejected a lawsuit filed by Greta Thunberg and other young activists.
They were suing the state for insufficient climate change action.
That's a setback for the youth climate movement.
It is. It highlights the challenges of using legal avenues to force climate action.
It's a reminder that the fight for climate justice is an uphill battle.
It is, but it's a battle we need to keep fighting.
Absolutely. And speaking of fighting, a new AI system has been developed that can accurately map urban green spaces.
That's pretty cool.
It is. This technology could help us better understand and manage these vital areas in our cities.
Green spaces are essential for human health, biodiversity, and climate resilience.
So this AI system could be a valuable tool for creating more sustainable and livable cities.
Exactly. And speaking of sustainability, a new report has found that large corporations are funneling the majority of their profits to shareholders instead of investing in clean energy.
So they're choosing short-term gains over long-term sustainability.
It seems that way, even though many of these companies claim to be committed to fighting climate change.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly, and in this case, their actions are speaking volumes.
It's a reminder that we need to hold corporations accountable for their environmental impact.
And that we need to support businesses that are genuinely committed to sustainability.
Absolutely. And speaking of accountability, there's been a new development in the story about the potential carcinogen in the water supply in areas affected by the wildfires in Los Angeles.
The authorities are now saying that the contamination is more widespread than initially thought.
That's concerning.
It is. It means that more people are at risk.
And it highlights the need for a thorough and comprehensive investigation.
We need to know the full extent of the contamination and what steps need to be taken to protect public health.
It's a reminder that the impacts of these disasters can be far-reaching and long-lasting.
Absolutely. And speaking of long-lasting impacts, the Trump administration is facing criticism for their efforts to dismantle environmental justice offices within federal agencies.
These offices are responsible for ensuring that all communities have equal access to a clean and healthy environment.
Exactly. And dismantling them send a clear message that the administration is not prioritizing environmental justice.
It's a step backward.
It is. And it's a reminder that we need to be vigilant in defending environmental justice.
We need to make sure that all communities have a voice in decisions that affect their health and well-being.
Absolutely. And speaking of voices, the Trump administration is facing accusations of trying to silence the California Coastal Commission.
By attaching conditions to federal aid for Los Angeles.
Yes. It seems like they're trying to use disaster relief as leverage to advance their own agenda.
That's concerning.
It is. Disaster relief should not be politicized.
It's a reminder that we need to hold our leaders accountable for their actions and ensure that they're acting in the best interests of the people.
Absolutely. And speaking of acting in the best interests of the people, there's a new study that shows how hotter temperatures are affecting sea turtles.
They're leading to a higher proportion of female hatchlings.
Exactly, which could have long-term consequences for sea turtle populations.
It's another example of how climate change is impacting the natural world in ways we might not even fully understand yet.
And it's a reminder that we need to take action to mitigate climate change before it's too late.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking action, the Trump administration has halted U.S. participation in a key IPCC climate meeting.
This is a concerning development.
It sends a clear message that the administration is not prioritizing climate change.
And that they're not interested in working with the international community to address this global crisis.
It's a step in the wrong direction.
It is, and it's a reminder that we need to keep pushing for climate action at all levels of government.
We can't afford to wait for our leaders to act.
We need to take matters into our own hands.
Absolutely. And speaking of taking matters into our own hands, many U.S. cities are facing a looming fiscal crisis.
Due to rising costs, declining revenues, and the growing burden of climate change impacts.
So cities are being squeezed from all sides.
They are, and it's going to make it harder for them to adapt to the challenges of climate change.
We need to find ways to support our cities and make them more resilient.
Agreed. And speaking of resilience, there's a new report that highlights the innovative work of the Trans Disaster Relief Fund.
This fund is helping transgender people recover and rebuild after disasters.
It's a reminder that disaster relief efforts need to be inclusive and address the unique needs of all communities.
Absolutely. Everyone deserves support and compassion in times of crisis.
And speaking of compassion, there's a new report that highlights the lack of affordable solar power in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is forcing indigenous communities to rely on wood for fuel. It contributes to deforestation and keeps those communities trapped in poverty.
It's a reminder that the shift to clean energy needs to be fair for everyone.
We can't leave anyone behind. And over in Sweden, Greta Thunberg and other young activists just had a setback in their fight for climate action.
Their lawsuit against the state for not doing enough on climate change was rejected by the Supreme Court.
It's tough to use legal channels to force change.
It is, but it's important to keep trying. We need to explore every avenue. And on a more positive note, there's a new study about urban microforests. Those sound interesting. What are they?
There are these mini forests planted in cities using the Miyawaki technique. They grow super fast, and they can help fight pollution and make cities greener.
It's amazing how people are finding ways to bring nature back into our concrete jungles. Speaking of innovation, remember those lithium iron phosphate batteries we talked about?
The LFP batteries, yes, they're gaining traction as a cheaper and safer alternative to the current standard.
That's great news. Could really shake things up in the EV market.
Potentially, but scaling up production and dealing with trade issues are still hurdles to overcome.
There are always challenges, but it's exciting to see these new technologies emerging. And speaking of challenges, a new report has highlighted the alarming rate at which glaciers worldwide are melting.
It's a stark reminder of how climate change is already impacting our planet.
Melting glaciers contribute to rising sea levels, threaten freshwater supplies, and disrupt ecosystems.
It's a global crisis, and while we're on the topic of global issues, Illinois is taking steps to encourage people to switch to electric vehicles.
How so?
A major utility company there has launched a huge rebate program to fund EV charging stations.
That's fantastic. It's great to see states and utilities taking the lead on this.
It's a step in the right direction.
And speaking of steps in the right direction, the protests and pressure from elected officials in Los Angeles have paid off.
They've managed to halt the flow of toxic debris to local landfills after those wildfires.
That's a big win for the community and the environment.
It shows what can happen when people come together and demand action.
Power to the people. And speaking of power, a new study has found that hotter temperatures could lead to more peatland fires in the UK.
Which would release even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, further fueling climate change.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is, and it highlights the importance of protecting and restoring peatlands.
They're vital carbon sinks. We need to keep them healthy. Speaking of healthy ecosystems, there's a new report that highlights the struggles of farmers in North Carolina who are still trying to recover from Hurricane Helene.
Months later, they're still facing significant challenges.
It's a reminder that the impacts of climate change can be long-lasting and devastating, especially for vulnerable communities.
We need to do more to support these communities and help them build resilience.
Agreed. It's about creating a future where everyone has the resources and support they need to thrive. And that's a wrap for today's deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from melting glaciers to electric vehicles to the resilience of the human spirit.
It's clear that the challenges we face are complex and interconnected. But there's also hope.
There is. People are innovating, communities are organizing, and the fight for a sustainable future continues.
So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for a better world.
We'll see you back here tomorrow for another deep dive into the news that matters.